The call came in on a Tuesday morning, November 3rd, 2023. A woman's voice on the other end of the line. Steady, calm, but with the weight of something she had been carrying for a very long time. "I need to tell you about something," she said to the detective who answered. "Something I saw. Something I've been keeping to myself for 37 years. And I can't keep the secret anymore." For 37 years, the murder of David Thornton had remained one of the most haunting unsolved cases in the history of Portland, Oregon. A young man, murdered in his own home. No witnesses. No apparent motive. No suspects. A case that had gone cold decades ago, filed away in boxes in the evidence room, gathering dust alongside hundreds of other forgotten crimes. But on that Tuesday morning, everything changed. Because a woman who had kept quiet for nearly 4 decades, finally decided to tell the truth. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She was 63 years old. A retired teacher. A widow. Someone who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a small town in Northern California for the past 20 years. No one knew her secret. No one even knew she had been connected to the crime at all. But she had been there. On the night of March 15, 1986, the night David Thornton was murdered, Sarah Mitchell had witnessed something. She had seen someone. She had seen the killer. And for 3.5 decades, she had said nothing. This is the story of that murder. This is the story of a witness who carried a terrible burden in silence. And this is the story of what finally broke that silence, and how it changed everything. To understand this story, we need to understand the victim. Because David Thornton wasn't just a name in a file. He was a person. A real person with dreams, with flaws, with a life that mattered. David Thornton was born on July 14, 1963. The youngest of 3 children. His parents, Robert and Margaret Thornton, were hard-working people. His father was an accountant. His mother was a nurse. They were a middle-class family living in southeast Portland during the 1960s and 1970s, a time of economic growth and relative stability. David was a quiet child. According to his mother's journals, discovered years later by investigators, he was sensitive. He cried easily. He preferred reading to sports. He was artistic. He loved music. He wanted to be a composer. By all accounts, he was a gentle soul. His older siblings remembered him differently. His brother Michael said in an interview years later, "David was always the weak link in the family. That sounds harsh, but that's what we thought. He wasn't tough. He wasn't ambitious. He was just different." By high school, David had become more introverted. He joined the school band. He played piano. He was in the drama club. He had a small group of close friends, but he wasn't popular. He wasn't the type of person who went to parties or played sports or competed for status. He was the type of person people overlooked. After high school, David attended Portland Community College for a year, then transferred to the University of Oregon, where he studied music composition. He wasn't an exceptional student academically, but he was passionate about his music. His professors noted that he had talent, though they also noted that he seemed to struggle with confidence. In 1985, at the age of 21, David moved into his own apartment in southeast Portland. It was a modest one-bedroom place in an older building, but it was his. For the first time in his life, he was living independently. He was working part-time at a local music store and taking private students for piano lessons. It wasn't much, but it was a start. His life was quiet, uneventful, normal. But there was something underneath the surface. Something that his family and friends didn't fully understand. David was struggling with his identity. He was questioning who he was. He was wrestling with feelings that he hadn't fully processed or expressed to the people around him. None of this was obvious to casual observers. To the world, David Thornton was just a quiet, unremarkable young man. A music student. A piano teacher. A person no one really paid attention to. But on March 15, 1986, someone paid very close attention to David Thornton. And on that night, he was murdered. March 15, 1986. A Saturday evening. David Thornton's apartment building was a 3-story structure in southeast Portland, the kind of older residential building that housed young people and people on tight budgets. It was 8:47 p.m. when the call came in to the Portland Police Department. A neighbor, Tom Bradley, had heard what sounded like a struggle coming from David's apartment. He had heard something fall. He had heard a scream. But by the time he mustered the courage to check on it, the sounds had stopped. He waited for a while, uncertain what to do. Eventually, he worked up the nerve to knock on David's door. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Tom called the police. He told them he was concerned about his neighbor. He had heard sounds that worried him. The police arrived at 8:57 p.m. Officers arrived at the apartment. When no one answered the door, they obtained a key from the building manager and let themselves in. What they found was devastating. David Thornton's body was in the bedroom. He was lying on his back on the floor next to his bed. He had been stabbed multiple times. The medical examiner would later determine that there were 17 stab wounds. The wounds were concentrated on his chest and abdomen. Several had penetrated his heart and lungs. He had died from blood loss and massive trauma. The apartment was in disarray. Furniture had been overturned. A lamp was broken. There were signs of a struggle. But there was something else. Something that puzzled investigators from the very beginning. Nothing was missing. David's wallet was on the nightstand. It contained $97 and his ID. His small television set was still in the living room. His stereo equipment was untouched. His apartment door had not been forced. There were no signs of a break-in. This wasn't a robbery, Detective Frank Morrison said, studying the scene. This was personal. The forensic team documented the scene meticulously. Photographs, blood spatter analysis, hair samples, fiber evidence. Everything was catalogued and collected. But the murder weapon was never found. No knife, no blade, nothing that could have been used to inflict the wounds. The killer took the weapon with them, one investigator noted. The autopsy, performed the following day by medical examiner Dr. Patricia Holland, revealed that David Thornton had been killed between approximately 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. on March 15th, based on body temperature and rigor mortis. The killer had known how to use a blade effectively. The wounds showed precision, anger, fury. This wasn't a crime of passion in the moment, Dr. Holland said. This was deliberate. This was someone who meant to hurt this person, who meant to kill this person. Detective Morrison immediately began the investigation. He interviewed neighbors. He attempted to identify people who had been in the building on that evening. He collected witness statements. But the apartment building was the type of place where people kept to themselves. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Or if they had, they weren't talking. The investigation produced a few leads. Some people mentioned that David had been seeing someone. A romantic interest. But the descriptions were vague. No one could provide a name. No one could provide a clear description. Some said it was a man. Some said it might have been a woman. The details were contradictory and unclear. By the end of the first week, the case had stalled. No clear suspects. No clear motive. No clear direction for the investigation. By the end of the first month, the case had gone nowhere. By the end of the first year, the case had gone cold. And for the next 36 years, it remained cold. The murder of David Thornton became one of Portland's forgotten crimes. It was filed away. The case was marked as inactive. The investigative files were boxed up and stored in the archives. Detective Frank Morrison, who had worked the case initially, eventually retired in 1997. He died in 2003 without ever knowing who had killed David Thornton. The file sat untouched for decades. Every few years, someone would review it, looking for any missed leads or new angles, but nothing ever materialized. The case remained a mystery. There were a few persistent people who tried to keep the case in the public eye. David's mother, Margaret Thornton, became an advocate for unsolved murders. She gave speeches at community centers. She organized small memorials on the anniversary of David's death. She was determined that her son would not be forgotten. Margaret Thornton died in 2005 at the age of 81. She went to her grave not knowing who had murdered her son. David's father, Robert Thornton, had died even earlier, in 1994. He had never recovered from the trauma of losing his youngest child. So by the time 2023 arrived, almost no one was left who remembered David Thornton. Almost no one was left who cared about solving his murder. The case had simply faded away, becoming just another statistic in Portland's long history of unsolved crimes. But somewhere out there, someone knew the truth. And that someone was Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Chen was born in 1960 in Portland, Oregon. Her family was Chinese American. Her father worked at a restaurant. Her mother was a seamstress. Sarah grew up in a tight-knit community of immigrants and their children. She was smart. She was well-liked. She was the type of student who got good grades and followed the rules. In 1980, at the age of 20, she was dating a man named Robert Mitchell. They had been dating for 2 years. They were planning to get married. But in 1980, Sarah became friends with someone. A new person in her life. A person who would change everything. David Thornton. Sarah met David at a community music event. She had gone with a friend. David was performing. He was playing piano. And something about him intrigued her. After the performance, she went to talk to him. They exchanged phone numbers. They started hanging out. It was during these hangouts that Sarah began to understand something about David that the rest of the world didn't see. David was struggling with his identity. David was wrestling with who he was and who society expected him to be. David was lonely. Profoundly lonely. Sarah became a confidant. David told her things he hadn't told anyone else. He told her about his feelings. He told her about his confusion. He told her that he didn't think he was attracted to women in the way that men were supposed to be. He told her that he was attracted to men, but that he was terrified of what that meant. This was 1985. This was a different time. Being gay was not something you talked about openly in Portland. It was not something you admitted to. Especially not in a family like David's, where there was already an undercurrent of expectation and judgment. Sarah listened. Sarah was supportive. Sarah never judged him. For David, having someone to talk to was transformative. It was liberating. It allowed him to be, for the first time in his life, authentically himself around at least one person. Meanwhile, Sarah's relationship with Robert Mitchell continued. They got married in 1982. They had 2 children. They built a life together. Sarah became a teacher. She worked at a local elementary school. She was good at her job. She was liked by her students and colleagues. But she maintained her friendship with David. It was a close friendship. A meaningful friendship. She was one of the few people in David's life who knew the real him. Then, in early 1986, something happened that would change the course of both their lives. In the months leading up to March 15, 1986, David Thornton had been going through a significant change. He had finally begun to accept who he was. He had started going to a support group for LGBTQ individuals. He had started to make new friends in the community. He was becoming more confident, more open, more himself. But this openness came with complications. His family didn't know. His work colleagues didn't know. In fact, most people in his life didn't know. Only a select few trusted friends knew the real David. One of those people was Sarah Mitchell. In March 1986, David told Sarah something. He said he had met someone. A man. And this man was interested in David. David was interested in him. They were exploring what might become a romantic relationship. David was excited. David was nervous. David was scared. This was the first time he was allowing himself to pursue romantic feelings openly, even if it was just with one person. Sarah was happy for him, but she was also worried. She knew that David's family would not be accepting. She knew that being openly gay in 1986 carried serious risks. She knew that David was vulnerable. "Be careful," she told him. "Be cautious. Not everyone is going to understand." David said he was being careful. He said this man seemed nice, trustworthy, kind. But Sarah had a feeling. A nagging sense that something wasn't right. On March 14, 1986, a Friday, Sarah and David met for coffee. They did this regularly. It was their tradition. They would go to a small cafe and talk for a while. David seemed troubled. He seemed anxious. When Sarah asked what was wrong, David admitted that things with the man he had been seeing were becoming complicated. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "He's becoming possessive," David said. "He doesn't want me going to the support group anymore. He doesn't want me seeing my other friends. He says he's the only person I should trust. And when I told him I wasn't comfortable with that, he got angry. He said things. Mean things." Sarah felt her chest tighten. Red flags. Every single alarm bell was ringing. "David, I don't like the sound of this. Who is this guy? I want to know who he is." But David wouldn't tell her. He said he didn't want to involve her. He said he would handle it. He said he was sure the man would calm down. That it would all be fine. Sarah wasn't convinced, but she also knew David. He was stubborn in his own way. Once he made a decision, it was hard to change his mind. "Just be careful," Sarah said again. "Please. Be very careful." The next day, March 15th, 1986, was a Saturday. Sarah was at home with her family. She was preparing dinner. She was spending time with her children. It was a normal day. A normal evening. At 6:15 p.m., she received a phone call. It was from David. "Sarah, I need to see you," he said. "Can you come over? I need to talk to you about something. It's important." "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. "Just come," David said. "Please." Sarah looked at her husband. She looked at her children. It was Saturday evening. She was supposed to be home with her family. But something in David's voice worried her. Something sounded urgent. "Okay," she said. "I'm coming." She told Robert she was going out for a while. She needed to check on a friend who was having some problems. Robert didn't ask too many questions. They drove separate cars now. He trusted her. At 6:47 p.m., Sarah arrived at David's apartment building. She parked on the street. She went upstairs. She knocked on David's door. What happened in the next few minutes would be something Sarah would carry with her for the next 37 years. Sarah knocked on David's door. There was no answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. She tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. She opened the door slightly. "David," she called out. "It's me. It's Sarah." That's when she heard him, coming from the bedroom. A sound that was somewhere between a cry and a scream. A sound of pain or fear or both. "David!" Sarah called out, and she pushed the door open. She rushed toward the bedroom. And as she reached the doorway, she saw him. David was on the floor. There was a man on top of him. A man with his back to Sarah. A man who was holding something in his hand. Something that looked like a knife. The man was stabbing David. Over and over. Again and again. With a fury and violence that Sarah's mind couldn't initially process. For a moment, just a moment, Sarah was frozen. She couldn't move. She couldn't process what she was seeing. It didn't seem real. It seemed like something from a movie. Something that couldn't actually be happening. But then the man became aware of her presence. He looked over his shoulder. Their eyes met. For perhaps 2 seconds, they stared at each other. And then he lunged toward her. Sarah screamed. She turned and ran. She ran toward the door. She ran down the hallway. She ran down the stairs. She didn't look back. She just ran. She got to her car. She fumbled with her keys. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely get the key in the ignition. But she managed. She started the car. She drove away. She didn't call the police. She didn't go back. She didn't tell anyone what she had seen. Instead, she drove around the city for 2 hours. She cried. She shook. She tried to process what had just happened. And she tried to convince herself that maybe she hadn't seen what she thought she'd seen. Maybe she'd misunderstood the situation. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. But she knew that was a lie. She knew exactly what she had seen. By the time she got home, it was after 9 p.m. Robert asked her where she had been. She told him that David had called, but that by the time she got there, he wasn't home. She had driven around looking for him. She hadn't been able to find him. It was a lie. But it was a lie she was prepared to commit to. The next morning, Sunday, March 16, 1986, Sarah heard the news. A young man had been found murdered in his apartment in southeast Portland. The news report didn't have many details. But Sarah knew. She knew who they were talking about. She knew that David was dead. And she knew who had killed him. In the days following David's murder, Sarah was consumed by fear. Fear and guilt and confusion all tangled together into something that was nearly unbearable. She knew she should go to the police. She knew she should tell them what she had seen. But she was terrified. First, there was the very practical fear. The man she had seen, she didn't know who he was. She hadn't known his name. And if the police investigated and caught him, he would know who had identified him. He would know that she had been a witness. What if he came after her? What if he tried to hurt her? Sarah had 2 small children. Robert had a family. What if by coming forward, she put everyone she loved in danger? Second, there was the social fear. If she came forward, it would come out that David was gay. It would come out that he had been exploring a romantic relationship with a man. And it would come out that Sarah had known about it. That she had been supportive of it. That she had helped him in ways that many people in that community would not have approved of. This was 1986. Being gay was still deeply stigmatized. Sarah's family was traditional. Her church was traditional. Her community was traditional. If it came out that she had been helping David explore his identity, helping him accept himself, there would be serious consequences. Robert would be questioned. Why was his wife spending time with a gay man? What were they doing together? Rumors would spread. Suspicions would develop. Her marriage could suffer. Her relationship with her children could suffer. Third, there was the deep psychological trauma. Sarah had witnessed a murder. She had seen a man stabbed 17 times. She had seen David's face. She had seen his pain. That image was burned into her mind. She couldn't unsee it. She couldn't unhear his cry. Talking about it, describing it, reliving it in court, that seemed unbearable. So she decided to say nothing. It was a decision she made in the days immediately following David's death. It was a decision she committed to. And it was a decision she carried with her for 37 years. She never told Robert. She never told her children. She never told her friends. She never told her therapist, when she eventually started seeing one in the 1990s, dealing with anxiety and depression. She told no one. The guilt was immense. She would think about David's parents. She would think about Margaret and Robert Thornton, who would never know what had happened to their son. Who would never get justice. Who would never get closure. She thought about them at night. She couldn't sleep. She would lie awake next to Robert and think about how her silence was a betrayal of Margaret and Robert. How her fear was allowing a killer to walk free. But she didn't come forward. Years passed. Sarah's children grew up. Robert died in 2011. Sarah retired from teaching. She moved to Northern California. She tried to start a new life. But the secret never left her. It was always there. A weight that she carried. A burden that never lessened. In 2022, Sarah Mitchell received a diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The doctors gave her a year. Maybe 2 if she was lucky. She was 62 years old. She had never remarried after Robert's death. She didn't have a lot of close relationships. She had her adult children, but she wasn't particularly close to them. She had a few friends. She had her routines. And she had her secret. When she received the diagnosis, something shifted inside her. Suddenly, the calculus of her life changed. She was going to die. That was certain. There was no escaping that reality. And when she died, she would take the secret with her. 4 months after the diagnosis, she thought about David. She thought about his face. She thought about what had happened to him. She thought about his parents, both of whom had already passed away. She thought about the injustice that had never been addressed. She thought about the man who had killed David. The man she had seen in David's apartment. The man whose face was etched in her memory. Was he still alive? Was he living his life? Was he out there, having never faced consequences for what he had done? The thought infuriated her. The thought sickened her. At the same time, she was terrified. She was facing her own mortality. She was alone. She was vulnerable. And she was about to expose herself to a legal process that she didn't fully understand. In the summer of 2023, Sarah started having conversations with herself. She would sit on her porch in Northern California, looking out at the yard, and she would have internal arguments about what she should do. The part of her that was afraid would say, "Sarah, you're dying. Why would you want to spend your last months dealing with police and lawyers and courts? Why would you want to relive this trauma? Just let it go. Let David rest. Let the man who killed him continue living his life. You've carried this secret for 37 years. You can take it to your grave." But another part of her, a part that had grown stronger as she had gotten older, would respond, "Is that who you want to be? Someone who kept silent while a killer walked free? Someone who let fear prevent her from doing the right thing? Someone who cared more about her own comfort than about justice?" These internal conversations went on for months. Sarah became increasingly conflicted, increasingly troubled. The cancer was progressing. Her health was deteriorating. Time was running out, and she still hadn't made a decision. Then, in October 2023, something happened that forced her hand. Sarah's younger sister, Michelle, came to visit her. Michelle had been a social worker her entire life. She had spent decades helping vulnerable people. She had dedicated her life to seeking justice for people who had been wronged. Sarah hadn't intended to tell Michelle anything. But as they sat together on Sarah's porch one evening, drinking tea, Michelle said something that struck her deeply. "I've spent my whole life helping people find justice," Michelle said. "And I've learned something. The people who do the right thing, the people who have the courage to speak up even when it's hard, they're the ones who can die in peace. They're the ones who know that they did everything they could to make the world a little bit better." Sarah heard those words, and something broke inside her. She started crying. And then, for the first time, she told someone about David. She told Michelle everything. Michelle listened. And when Sarah finished, Michelle said something simple but powerful. "You have to go to the police, Sarah. You have to tell them what you saw. It's not about whether it's convenient for you. It's not about whether you're afraid. It's about doing the right thing. And you know that." Sarah did know that. She had always known that. A week later, on November 3, 2023, Sarah made the call. Detective Sarah Chen had been working cold cases in the Portland Police Department for 15 years. She was one of the best cold case detectives in the department. She had solved 12 previously unsolved murders by reopening cases, re-examining evidence, and pursuing new leads that others had missed. On Tuesday morning, November 3, 2023, she was at her desk reviewing files when the phone rang. It was an unusual call. Most of the time, the tip lines were flooded with calls from people claiming to have information, but most of it was not credible. People claiming aliens had committed murders. People with conspiracy theories. People who were disturbed or looking for attention. But as Detective Chen listened to Sarah Mitchell, she knew immediately that this was different. Sarah was calm. She was articulate. She was providing specific details. She was describing something that she had witnessed. She wasn't claiming conspiracy theories or fantastical scenarios. She was simply stating facts. "I was there," Sarah said. "I was there the night David Thornton was murdered. I saw the man who killed him. And I'm 63 years old, and I'm dying, and I can't keep this secret anymore." Detective Chen's heart raced. This was huge. This was the kind of break that cold case detectives dream about. "I need you to come in," Detective Chen said. "I need you to give a formal statement. Can you do that?" "Yes," Sarah said. "I can. I will." Within hours, Sarah Mitchell had been brought to the Portland Police Department. She was in an interview room with Detective Chen. And for the next 8 hours, Sarah recounted everything she had seen and everything she remembered from that night in 1986. The detective recorded the interview. She took detailed notes. She asked clarifying questions. She was gentle but thorough. What Sarah was able to provide was invaluable. She described the man who had killed David. She described his physical characteristics, his approximate age, his build, the color of his hair. She described what he was wearing. She described the expression on his face when he had seen her. "Did you recognize him?" Detective Chen asked. "Did you know who he was?" Sarah shook her head. "No. I had never seen him before. I don't know his name. I don't know anything about him except what I saw that night." "And you didn't go to the police because—" Sarah took a long time before answering. And when she did, she explained everything. The fear, the social stigma, the trauma, the weight of the secret. Detective Chen listened without judgment. She understood. She was a woman. She understood fear. She understood the complications of speaking up. "You're doing the right thing now," Detective Chen said. "That's what matters." With Sarah Mitchell's statement, the David Thornton murder case was immediately reopened. Detective Chen pulled the original files. She reviewed the evidence that had been collected decades ago. She looked at the photographs of the crime scene. She reviewed the autopsy report. One thing struck her immediately. The original investigation had noted that David had been seeing someone. Multiple neighbors had mentioned that there had been a man visiting David's apartment regularly in the weeks before the murder. But the investigation had never developed this lead. It had simply faded away. Detective Chen understood why. It was 1986. Being openly gay was dangerous. People weren't going to talk about a gay relationship in 1986, especially not to police. The original investigators probably hadn't known to look for that angle. But now, with Sarah's statement, the investigation had a clear direction. David had been seeing a man. This man had become possessive and controlling. David had wanted to end the relationship. And on March 15, 1986, this man had come to David's apartment and murdered him. The question was, who was this man? Detective Chen began the painstaking work of trying to identify him. She went back to David's friends, looking for any mention of this man. She looked at David's calendar, his phone records, anything that might give a clue. What she discovered was that David had been part of the LGBTQ community in Portland, even if he hadn't been entirely open about it. He had attended meetings. He had spent time in places where LGBTQ individuals gathered. Detective Chen began interviewing people who had known David in 1986. Many of these people were now in their 60s and 70s. Some had left Portland. Some had died. But she managed to track down several. One of them was Marcus Thompson, who had been part of the same support group that David had attended. Marcus was now 65 years old, living in Seattle. When Detective Chen contacted him, he agreed to be interviewed. "I remember David," Marcus said. "He was quiet, shy, but he was a nice guy. He was trying to figure out who he was. And he met someone. Around February or March of 1986, I remember he was talking about this man. He was excited at first. But then, a few weeks later, he seemed worried. He said the guy was becoming too controlling. He wanted to break it off." "Do you remember the man's name?" Detective Chen asked. Marcus thought about it. "I think it started with A.D., he said slowly. "Or maybe A.J. I'm not sure. It was a long time ago. But I remember David saying that this guy was jealous. That he didn't want David seeing anyone else. That he was becoming possessive. It wasn't much. But it was a start." Detective Chen began looking at David's address book. She found several names written in his hand. She began tracking down people associated with David. Some of these people were no longer in Portland. Some didn't remember anything useful. But one name stood out. In David's address book, there was a name, Jack. It had a phone number next to it. The number had been crossed out and rewritten several times, suggesting that it had changed multiple times. "Jack," Detective Chen said to herself. "Let's find Jack." Detective Chen filed a warrant to access David's phone records from 1986. Phone records were kept on microfiche, and it took time to retrieve them, but eventually she had them. David's phone records showed that he had been in frequent contact with a number. Multiple calls. Some lasting hours. Some just brief check-ins. The detective worked with the phone company to trace that number. Phone numbers had changed hands multiple times in the intervening decades. But the detective was able to track the owner of the number in 1986. The name associated with that number was Jack Morrison. Jack Morrison. Age 23 in 1986. According to the information the detective was able to gather, Jack Morrison had lived in southeast Portland in 1986. He had a job at a construction company. He had no record of arrest at that time. But where was he now? Detective Chen ran Jack Morrison through the system. There were multiple Jack Morrisons in the Portland area. She began methodically checking each one. The fourth Jack Morrison she checked matched the age profile. Born in 1962. Would have been 23 years old in 1986. Last known residence in Portland. But his current location was listed as unknown. However, the detective found something interesting. Jack Morrison had been arrested in 1989 in Los Angeles. He had been charged with assault and battery. The charges had been dropped, but the arrest record existed. He had been living in Los Angeles under a slightly different name, Jackson Morrison. Detective Chen began researching Jackson Morrison. Where had he gone after Los Angeles? She checked credit reports. She checked driver's license records. She checked arrest records in other states. What she found was a pattern. Jackson Morrison had lived in multiple states over the years. He had several arrests for assault. Nothing major, nothing that had resulted in serious prison time, but a pattern of violent behavior. Currently, according to the most recent information the detective could find, Jackson Morrison was living in Sacramento, California. He was 61 years old. He was living a quiet life. He had a job at a retail company. He had no record of having ever been questioned in connection with David Thornton's death. "We've got him," Detective Chen said when she realized what she had found. "We finally have a viable suspect." With Jackson Morrison identified as a likely suspect, Detective Chen began the work of building a case against him. But this was tricky. 37 years had passed. Physical evidence might be degraded or lost. Witnesses might not remember details clearly. But the detective had something valuable: Sarah Mitchell's eyewitness account. Sarah had provided a detailed description of the man she had seen in David's apartment. Detective Chen now had a photograph of Jackson Morrison from his 1989 arrest. She showed the photograph to Sarah. Sarah's reaction was immediate and visceral. She went pale. She started shaking. "That's him," she said. "That's the man I saw. I'm absolutely certain. That's his face." With this confirmation, Detective Chen knew she had her suspect. But she needed more than just eyewitness testimony. She needed physical evidence. Or she needed a confession. She filed a warrant to examine the original evidence from the crime scene. The evidence had been stored in the police department's evidence room for 37 years. Had it been properly maintained? Was it still viable? When the detective examined the evidence, she found something remarkable. The case files contained fibers that had been collected from David's apartment. They had been catalogued but never fully analyzed using modern forensic techniques. Detective Chen submitted the fibers for analysis using contemporary DNA technology. Modern forensics had advanced dramatically since 1986. What couldn't be determined then could potentially be determined now. The results came back 2 weeks later. The fibers had human DNA on them. The DNA profile didn't match David Thornton. It was from an unknown contributor. But when Detective Chen ran the DNA profile against the national database, she got a hit. The DNA matched Jackson Morrison's profile. Jackson Morrison had been arrested in 2003 for a minor offense, and his DNA had been collected and entered into the database. "This is it," Detective Chen said. "We have the evidence. We have the witness. We have the suspect." On December 1, 2023, nearly a month after Sarah Mitchell had come forward, Jackson Morrison was arrested. It happened quietly, without fanfare. A detective in Sacramento approached him as he was leaving his apartment. They had a warrant for his arrest in connection with the murder of David Thornton. Jackson Morrison, 61 years old, was cuffed and taken into custody. At first, Jackson Morrison seemed confused. He asked what this was about. The detective informed him that he was being arrested for the murder of David Thornton in 1986. Jackson Morrison's face went blank. He didn't say anything else. He asked for a lawyer, and beyond that, he remained silent. He was transported to Portland. He was booked into the Multnomah County Jail. He was held without bail, pending trial. The news of the arrest spread quickly. The media picked up the story. Unsolved murder solved after 37 years. Woman's deathbed confession leads to arrest. New technology and old witness solve decades-old murder. Sarah Mitchell's name was not initially released. She had requested anonymity, but her story was. A woman, motivated by conscience, had come forward after decades of silence to help solve a murder that had gone unsolved for nearly 4 decades. It was a compelling narrative. The media loved it. When Detective Chen interviewed Jackson Morrison at the jail, he was initially uncooperative. He had lawyered up. His attorney, a public defender named Thomas Ross, insisted that Jackson didn't have to say anything. But Detective Chen was patient. She understood the psychology of interrogation. She knew that people sometimes wanted to talk, even if their lawyer had advised them not to. "I have evidence," Detective Chen said. "I have DNA evidence that puts you in David Thornton's apartment on the night he was murdered. I have a witness who saw you commit the murder. I have phone records showing you were in contact with David. I have cell records showing you were in the area at the time of the murder." Jackson Morrison stared at her without expression. "The only question," Detective Chen continued, "is why? What happened between you and David? What made you so angry that you killed him?" For a long time, Jackson didn't say anything. But then he looked at his lawyer, and something seemed to pass between them. A conversation without words. His lawyer said, "My client would like to make a statement." What Jackson Morrison revealed over the next 4 hours was the story of a man driven to murderous rage by possessive love and rejection. Jackson had met David at a bar in 1985. They had connected. They had started spending time together. Jackson had believed they were entering into a romantic relationship. But David, he said, had been playing games. David had been seeing other people. David had been telling Jackson one thing but doing another. "I loved him," Jackson said, his voice cold and flat. "And he was making a fool of me." When David had ended the relationship in March 1986, Jackson had become enraged. He had come to David's apartment. He had wanted to talk to David. He had wanted to convince David to take him back. But David had refused. David had told him to leave. David had said that he didn't want to see Jackson anymore. "I felt something break inside me," Jackson said. "I saw a knife in the kitchen. I took it. And I couldn't control myself. I was so angry, so full of rage. And it all came out." He had stabbed David 17 times. He had killed the man he claimed to love. And then he had run. He had thrown the knife away. He had left Portland and never returned. For 37 years, he had lived his life. He had moved around. He had had other relationships. He had worked. He had existed in a kind of limbo, not quite imprisoned but not quite free, carrying the weight of what he had done. "I knew eventually I would be caught," Jackson Morrison said. "I've always known. Because you don't do something like that and get away with it forever. Eventually, someone comes forward. Eventually, the truth comes out." And it had. The trial of Jackson Morrison took place over 3 weeks in March 2024. Jackson entered a plea of guilty to second-degree murder, which meant he was acknowledging that he had killed David Thornton but claiming that it was not premeditated. But the prosecution argued that it was premeditated. They argued that Jackson had deliberately taken a knife. That he had stabbed David 17 times, showing clear intent to kill. The judge ruled that the evidence supported a charge of first-degree murder. Sarah Mitchell testified at the trial. It was difficult for her. She had to relive that night. She had to describe what she had seen. She had to face Jackson Morrison across the courtroom. But she did it. She spoke calmly and clearly. She described the man in David's apartment stabbing him repeatedly. She identified Jackson Morrison as that man. The DNA evidence was presented. The phone records were presented. The confession was presented. The case against Jackson Morrison was overwhelming. He was convicted of first-degree murder on March 28, 2024. On June 2, 2024, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah Mitchell's cancer went into remission. The doctors didn't have an explanation for it. They called it a medical miracle. Sarah called it a second chance. She continued to live in Northern California. She became an advocate for victim advocacy. She worked with organizations that helped people who had experienced trauma related to witnessing crimes. "I spent 37 years being silent," she said in an interview. "I was motivated by fear, by shame, by the desire to protect myself. And I wasted all those years. I wish I had come forward immediately. I wish I had had the courage to do the right thing from the beginning." Her story inspired others. There were 2 other cold cases solved in 2024 as a result of people who had remained silent coming forward after hearing about Sarah Mitchell's decision to finally speak. Jackson Morrison is serving his life sentence in a maximum security prison in Oregon. He has never shown remorse. He has never expressed regret. He simply exists, serving out the remainder of his life in a cell. David Thornton's memory was finally honored. A memorial service was held in Portland. His family members, who had kept his secret in life, were able to publicly acknowledge his existence and his life. His mother's journals were donated to LGBTQ archives at a local university. David's music was preserved. Some of his compositions were performed at the memorial service. For the first time, publicly, people heard the music that David Thornton had created. It was beautiful. It was tragic. It was a glimpse into the soul of a man who had been taken too soon. The David Thornton murder case and its resolution had a significant impact on how the Portland Police Department approached cold cases involving LGBTQ victims. Detective Sarah Chen was promoted to head of the cold case unit. One of her first actions was to re-examine all unsolved murders from the 1980s and 1990s involving LGBTQ individuals. She believed that some of these cases may have been deprioritized or not investigated as thoroughly because of the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity. By 2025, 3 additional murders had been solved using techniques similar to those used in the David Thornton case. The case also brought attention to the dangers of possessive and controlling relationships, particularly within the LGBTQ community, where victims might be less likely to reach out for help. Domestic violence organizations began working with LGBTQ support groups to provide better resources and education about recognizing and escaping abusive relationships. Sarah Mitchell was invited to speak at universities and community centers about the importance of coming forward as a witness, even when doing so is difficult and frightening. The story of Sarah Mitchell and the murder of David Thornton teaches us several important lessons. First, it teaches us about the weight of silence. Sarah carried a secret for 37 years. That secret affected her mental health. It affected her ability to have authentic relationships. It created a barrier between her and the truth. And in the end, the relief she felt when she finally spoke was immense. Second, it teaches us about the power of conscience. Even though Sarah was afraid, even though she had every reason to stay silent, her conscience eventually won out. She knew that what she had done, keeping quiet, was wrong. And she was willing to face her fear to make it right. Third, it teaches us about how justice can be served even decades later. We often think of justice as something that happens quickly, in the immediate aftermath of a crime. But the David Thornton case shows us that justice can be served years or even decades later. That it's never too late to do the right thing. Fourth, it teaches us about the limitations of fear. Sarah had convinced herself that she couldn't come forward because of all the terrible things that might happen. But in the end, almost none of those things happened. She spoke up. She wasn't destroyed by it. She wasn't ostracized by her community. She wasn't killed by the person she had testified against. Fear had kept her silent for 37 years. But when she finally faced her fear, she discovered that the fear had been worse than the reality. Finally, it teaches us about the importance of creating a society where people feel safe coming forward. Sarah waited until she was dying of cancer to speak up. How many witnesses never speak up at all? How many crimes go unsolved because people are too afraid to share what they know? This is a question that society needs to grapple with. We need to create a culture in which people feel safe sharing information about crimes. We need to protect witness anonymity when necessary. We need to provide support to people who have witnessed traumatic events. The David Thornton case wouldn't have been solved without Sarah Mitchell's courage. But it shouldn't have taken her 37 years and a terminal cancer diagnosis for her to find that courage. As of 2025, here is the status of the key figures in the case. Sarah Mitchell continues to live in Northern California. She is 64 years old. Her cancer remains in remission. She has become an advocate and speaker, telling her story to help others understand the importance of coming forward. She has written a book about her experience, which was published in 2024. She spends time with her sister Michelle, with whom she is now very close. Detective Sarah Chen was promoted to head of the Cold Case Unit in 2024. She has solved 8 additional cases since the David Thornton murder. She is considered one of the leading experts in cold case investigations in the country. She has been interviewed for numerous documentaries and has become an advocate for using modern forensic techniques to revisit old cases. Jackson Morrison is serving a life sentence without parole at the Oregon State Penitentiary. He is in his 60s now. He spends his days in his cell, reading, reflecting on what he has done. He has never been granted an interview with the media. His case file has become a reference point for prosecutors and investigators studying crimes driven by possessive jealousy and obsessive love. David Thornton's legacy has been preserved. His compositions have been performed by orchestras. His story has been told in documentaries and podcasts. He is remembered not just as a victim of a murder, but as an artist, a friend, and a person who was trying to live authentically in a time and place that made that difficult. The Portland Police Department has made significant changes in how it handles unsolved cases. Cold cases are now regularly revisited using modern forensic techniques. LGBTQ victims are given the same priority and attention as any other victim. The LGBTQ community in Portland holds an annual memorial to David Thornton and other victims of violence. The memorial is a reminder of how far the community has come, and how much work remains to be done to ensure the safety and dignity of LGBTQ individuals. This is the story of a murder that went unsolved for 37 years. This is the story of a woman who remained silent out of fear. This is the story of what happened when she finally found her courage. And this is the story of how justice,